Hello everyone, my name is Yasser Saeed. Welcome to the class of International Trade Theory, Econ 446. This is lecture number 11 and we are going to study the trade in Heckscher Ohlin model. So far we have covered the production possibility frontier and we have also covered the relationship among output prices, the input prices and the level of input. Then again we have covered the relationship among output prices, input prices, level of input with the level of output. In today's lecture we are going to cover how trade happens in the Heckscher Ohlin model, and we will also discuss the effect of trade on income distribution and income inequality as predicted by the Heckscher Ohlin model. Now remember that the basic idea of Heckscher Ohlin model is that countries have different factors of production. In some countries we may have more labor as compared to land. In this assumption, in our model, we say that domestic country is abundant in labor services, whereas foreign country is abundant in land resources. So, if we want to write it mathematically, we can write it as L by T, which is greater than L star by T star. L represents labor and T represents terrain or land, whereas star represents here that we are using these variables for foreign country. Likewise, the domestic country is scarce in land resources and the foreign country is scarce in labor resources. We also know that countries are assumed to have the same technology and they have identical consumer taste. So, except for these two factors, there is no change in countries. Now, because domestic country is abundant in labor services, it will be relatively efficient at producing cloth because cloth is labor intensive. What about the foreign country? Foreign country is abundant in land resources, therefore it will produce those goods which uses land more intensively. In our example, that is food. Since cloth is labor-intensive good, the domestic country's PPF, the production possibility frontier, allows higher ratio of cloth to food relative to the foreign country's PPF. In foreign country, what will happen? They will produce more of food, whereas in domestic country, they will produce more of cloth. At each relative price, the domestic country will produce a higher ratio of cloth to food than the foreign country. Again, the domestic country will have a higher relative supply of cloth than the. We can explore this relationship graphically as well. If you look at the blue curve, which is RD, RD shows the relative demand for cloth to food. The x-axis is the relative quantity of cloth to food and the y-axis is the relative price of cloth to food, represented as PC by PF. Let us talk about the relative quantity of cloth, that is QC plus QC star. So QC is the quantity produced in home and QC star is the quantity produced abroad. So the relative quantity is the collective or the summation of both quantities of cloth and similarly both quantities of food. RD, the relative demand as discussed, is the same. About the relative supply, RS shows the relative supply of cloth to food domestically, which is higher, or we can say it is more as compared to the relative supply of cloth to food in foreign. Why is this? This is because of our assumption that in domestic economy we have more labor, and because of that labor we will be producing labor intensive good, that is cloth. So the supply of cloth domestically will be more as compared to foreign. Now this leads to different equilibrium. In our case, that is equilibrium number 1, show that domestically prices of cloth to food will be low because it has more supply. PC by PF in domestic economy will be low. Whereas in foreign economy, the PC by PF will be high. Why? Because cloth is not produced there, therefore the availability of cloth is scarce and it will increase the overall prices of clothes in the foreign economy. But what about trade? If we allow for trade, then what will happen? Prices will converge. Why will prices converge? Because since domestically prices of cloth are low to food, importers, the foreign country will buy cloth from the domestic country, creating a kind of shortage in the domestic economy, which will uh, have an impact on the prices. So PC by PF in domestic economy will rise to compensate for the second equilibrium. PC by PF in domestic economy will rise, but in foreign economy, the shortage will deplete over time. Cloth will be available to them on cheaper prices from domestic economy, so the overall prices of cloth relative to food will decline. What is happening here? It is called the convergence of relative prices. Relative prices in both countries will converge to a single PC by PF. So, like the Ricardian model, the Heckscher Ohlin model also predicts a convergence of relative prices, and you have seen this conversion of prices in the previous graph. With trade, the relative price of cloth is predicted to rise in the labor-abundant country and fall in the labor-scarce country. As again we have seen in the graph, the prices will converge to a single price where the good is abundant, the prices will rise there. Where the good is scarce, the price will decline in that country. In the domestic country, the rise in relative price of cloth leads to rise in the relative production of cloth and the fall in relative consumption of cloth. The domestic country becomes an exporter and the exporter of cloth and importer of food, whereas the foreign country that will become an importer of cloth and an exporter of food. So what we can predict with Heckscher Ohlin model, we can predict an economy to be relatively efficient, or we may say that have comparative advantage in producing goods that are intensive in its abundant factors of production. If you want to predict what we will have to look at, we will see the country which factors it is abundant in. For certain resources, if they have more resources of labor, then we will see that it will be producing labor intensive goods. But if it has more land, it will produce land intensive good. And in similar fashion, if it has more capital, it will be producing more capital intensive goods. So with the help of Heckscher Ohlin model, we can predict what type of quantities or what type of goods will be produced in that economy. Then an economy is predicted to export goods that are intensive in its abundant factors of the production. Likewise, that we have said that if it has abundant resources of certain factors, that it will produce goods that has intensivity, and then an economy is predicted to export those goods. They will also export those goods as compared to the other goods. This proposition is called Heckscher Ohlin theorem. So Heckscher Ohlin theorem is all about the factor abundance. There is another important question that we can answer through Heckscher Ohlin model, that is, how much can we consume in this economy? Now, if there is no trade, we are not trading with any other country, then a country can consume whatever it produces. But if there is trade with other countries, then value of whatever we produce is important. We can consume equal to the value of our production. So here is a minute difference between when we are trading and when we are not trading. When we are not trading, we consume whatever we produce. It is important to note that here we are talking about the quantity alone. But if we are trading with other countries, then we can consume equal to the value of what we produce. We are not consuming whatever we are producing, but now the value of the production is important. So let me explain that through equation. Here we have this equation, PC into DC plus PF into DF equals PC into QC plus PF into DF. Now if you look at the right hand side of the equation, PC into QC plus PF into DF, this is the total value of our production. Can you see how the cloth that we have produced? Let's say we have produced 10 units of cloth and we are selling each unit on 10 rupees, and 10 multiplied by 10 equals to 100 rupees. So we are producing 100 rupees worth of cloth. And similarly, if we are producing 5 units of food, but the value of each unit of food is let's say again 10 rupees, then PF into QF is equal to 10 into 5, 150. So we are producing worth of food worth of 150 rupees. Combining these two, we are producing a total output worth of 100 plus 150, that is 250 rupees worth production. So we can consume equal to 250 rupees. We can purchase DC and DF, that actually shows demand of cloth and demand of food, and that should equal to the same value. So both sides should be equal. The price of the sell and the price of the purchase, both should be equal. So how does this work? Rewriting the equation, we get DF minus QF. We are actually taking food elements, variables related to food on the left hand side and variables relating to cloth on the right hand side. So we get DF minus QF equal to PC or PF into QC minus DC. Look at the first equation, that is demand for food minus the quantity of food produced. If demand for food is greater and the quantity of food produced is less, so what happens? We are demanding more than we are producing. So where this extra demand will come from? This will be our import, right? So the extra quantity will be imported through trade. And then QC minus DC. What does QC minus DC represent? QC is the quantity of cloth that we have produced, and DC is the demand for cloth. And if QC is greater than DC, then we are producing more than we are consuming. So what will happen? We will export the excess production. We are exporting the excess production. So what is the role of PC by PF? PC by PF actually tells us how much we can export or how much we can import for a given level of export. Meaning that if we have to import 10 units of food, and PC by PF, prices of both the goods is 1 rupee, if PC by PF means price of cloth is 100 and price of food is 100, so 100 divided by 100 we will get 1. So we will be able to export cloth of 10 rupees worth, right? But if we are importing let's say 10 worth of 10 rupees, and the price of cloth to price of food is double, right? We are selling cloth for 20 rupees, but we are buying food for 10 rupees. Then how much cloth do we need to export in order to get this import? That will equal to not 10, but now it will equal to 5. 5 multiplied by 2 equals 10. So both sides are balanced once again. So the more price of cloth increases, the greater can be our imports, or we will be exporting lesser quantity of cloth for that purpose. You see, these are this equation is the budget constraint for the economy. We have this is a linear equation. We have for example, this is our y is equal to b is the slope, and x is the x-axis variable, y is the y-axis variable, plus if you want to add a constant, that is 0 in our case. So actually the budget constraint is given by this equation. And if you want to convert it into the other format, here we get df minus qf, and take the entire right hand side equation to the left hand side, so that will be negative and it will equals. So here we are drawing it. Here is the graph. We are graphing the production possibility frontier with the budget constraint that we have just derived. Now look at the point that equilibrium 1. This is how much we should produce for the given value, and this is we have discussed in the lecture 1 why we should produce at equilibrium 1, because it gives us the maximum value. The entire red line is our production possibility frontier. On this red line we will be using our resources efficiently, but only there is a single combination of QF and QC which gives us the maximum value, and that is equilibrium 1. And when we sell at this equilibrium, if we are not trading, we will be consuming at point 1. But if we are going to sell it, if trade is allowed, then we can consume anywhere on this black line on the budget constraint. So this was the basic idea of the PC by PF. We can consume at let's say point, we can call it point 2. So we are able to consume at point 2. We are also able to consume at point 3. Where we should consume, this again depends on our indifference curve. Wherever our indifference curve as a nation is higher, we can consume at that point. Note that the budget constraint touches the PPF. A country can always afford to consume what it produces. As we have discussed earlier, we can produce equal to the value of our we can consume equal to the value of our production. However, a country need not to consume only the goods and services that it produces with trade. Exports and imports can be greater than 0. Furthermore, a country can afford to consume more of both goods with trade. If you want to consume more, we can trade for the extra quantity. On the same budget constraint, if you look, we were producing at point 1, But if you want to consume more of something, you want to consume more of food, we will sacrifice or we will export certain quantity of cloth in order to consume certain quantity of food. Similarly, the same is true for foreign country. Foreign country will also uh, reduce or sacrifice one good in order to import the other good. It will export uh, food, whereas it will import clothes from us. Again, moving to our older budget constraint and the production possibility frontier equation. Look at point 1. This is where we are going to produce, but we can consume at point 2. And what is the benefit of consumption at point 2? It is evident from the graph. Sorry, we are point 2 is already taken, so we let's say we call this point 3. The advantage of consumption at point 3 is that we are not able to produce this much quantity. We are able to produce on point 2. We are not able to produce more than that. But because of trade, we are able to consume much higher than that. We are able to consume at point 3. So this is the advantage of trade. It enables us to consume more than what we can produce. The value at point 3 is much more than the value at point 2. Similarly, if we draw indifference curve at this point, if we have indifference curve at this point, then that will also be higher than the indifference curve at point 2. Because of economy can afford to consume more with trade, the country as a whole is made better off. It has the advantage, it reaps the advantages of trade. But some do not gain from trade unless the model accounts for redistribution of income. All the people within the country do not get this advantage because some redistribution occurs. And let's talk about this redistribution. Trade changes relative prices of goods. If you remember, when we were not trading, there were two different supply curves. The relative supply curve of home was on the right side, where we were supplying more of cloth as compared to foreign. But when we allowed for trade, we converged to a single price, and because of that convergence, the prices within the country and abroad changes. When the prices changes, then the factor allocation will also change because of the reasons that we have discussed earlier. A rise in the price of cloth raises the purchasing power of domestic workers but lowers the purchasing power of landowners. Why? Because when price of cloth increases, wage rate of labor increases, but the rent of the landowners will decrease. So the purchasing power of workers will increase, but the purchasing power of landowners will decrease. So this is the income distribution occurring due to trade. The model predicts that owners of abundant factors gain with trade, but owners of scarce factors lose. Unlike the Ricardian model, the Heckscher Ohlin model predicts that input prices will be equalized among countries that trade. Because the relative output prices are equalized and because of the direct relationship between output price and factor prices are also equalized. They converge to each other. The basic idea of this discussion is that prices converge. Trade increases the demand of goods produced by abundant factors, indirectly increasing the demand of abundant factors themselves, raising the price of abundant factors across the countries. But factor prices are not really equal across countries. Factor prices will vary because resources are not transferable. This is the first reason. And also the model assumes that trading countries produce the same goods, So the prices for those goods will equalize, but countries may produce different goods. Within the same country, the same amount of quantity is not produced. The model also assumes that trading countries have the same technology, but different technologies could affect the productivity of factors, and therefore wages and rates paid to these factors will also change. The model also ignores trade barriers and transportation costs. We assume that there is no restriction on trade, there are no taxes, or we can say the tariff on trade. Similarly, no subsidies are given to domestic producers, and because these things prevent the factor prices from equalizing. Factor prices cannot be equal in the presence of such policies. The model also predicts outcome for long run, but after an economy liberalizes trade, factors of production may not quickly move to the industries that intensively use abundant factors. In the short run, the productivity of factors will be determined by their use of current industry, so that their wage rate may vary across. So that is the end of our lecture, and let us summarize all the points that we have studied. Uh, Substitution of factors used in production process is represented by a curved production possibility frontier. When an economy produces low quantity of goods, the opportunity cost of producing that good is low, and marginal productivity of resources used to produce that good is high. And when an economy produces high quantity of good, the opportunity cost of producing that good is high, and the marginal productivity of resources used to produce that good is low. So this actually tells us about the slope of the production possibility frontier, the discussion that we made on the slope, that it is curved, and the reason for that curvature was that marginal productivity decreases as we increase any of the factor of production. Then the second point is that when an economy produces the most it can from its resources, the opportunity cost of producing a good equals the relative prices of that good in the market. This is related to the budget constraint, the slope of the ISO value line. And it basically means that both production possibility frontier and the ISO value line must have a common slope, must have the same slope at a certain point. Then if a relative price of good increase, then the real wage or real lending renting rate of that factor used intensively in the production of the good is predicted to increase, while the real wage and real lending rate of other factors of production are predicted to decrease. If output price remain constant as the amount of factors of production increase, then the supply of goods that uses this factor intensively is predicted to increase, and supply of the other good is predicted to decrease. An economy is predicted to export goods that are intensive in its abundant factors of production and import goods that are intensive in its scarce factors of production. Then Heckscher Ohlin model predicts that relative output prices and factor prices will equalize, neither of which occurs in the real world. So if we look at empirical evidence, we didn't cover the empirical evidence in this chapter. Anyhow, the empirical evidence of the Heckscher Ohlin model suggests that in the real world, these prediction does not really occur. The model also predicts the owner of abundant factors gain, but the owner of scarce factor lose with trade. We discussed that with the reason that abundant factors earn more because they produce the goods and which requires that factor abundantly, and because of that they earn much. For example, if we were producing if we have abundant factor labor, So cloth is produced more, and since cloth is produced, price of cloth will be higher, and the income of laborers will be higher. A country as a whole is predicted to be better off with trade. So why this is true? Because we have discussed earlier that when we are producing something, we should consume equal to the worth of our production. In the absence of trade, we can only produce at on the production possibility frontier, and then we will only consume the goods that we have produced. But when we are trading, we can consume on the ISO value line, and ISO value line, except for the point where we are producing, it is usually higher than the production possibility frontier. So we consume more than we are able to than we are able to produce. Empirical support of Heckscher Ohlin model is weak. We do not find much evidence to support the Heckscher Ohlin model, but there are certain cases where we study the high income countries and low middle income countries. In those cases, the Heckscher Ohlin model theory supports the practical evidence. Otherwise, it has weak evidence. So that's all about our Heckscher Ohlin model. Uh, hope you have learned a lot from this lecture. If you have any question, please do ask in the comments. Thank you very much.